There is a version of you that already knows what to do. It knows what time to wake up. It knows what to eat and what to put down. It knows which habits are slowly hollowing you out, and which ones would rebuild you if you would only return to them consistently. It knows the work that needs to be done, the conversation that needs to be had, the decision that has been postponed for weeks past the point where postponing it still made any sense. That version of you is not a fantasy. It is not some idealized future self that exists only in the motivational language of people trying to sell you something. It is you, operating at the level of your own clearest thinking, your own deepest values, your own most honest assessment of what your life requires. The only thing standing between that version of you and the one reading these words right now is not knowledge. It is not talent. It is not circumstance or luck or the particular configuration of obstacles your life has arranged in front of you. It is discipline. And more specifically, it is the profound misunderstanding of what discipline actually is. Most people think of discipline as a force, something you apply to yourself from the outside, a kind of internal enforcement mechanism that overrides your desires and compels you toward behaviors you would not otherwise choose. They think of it as resistance, as the exhausting daily battle between what you want to do and what you know you should do, fought on the same ground every morning, requiring the same depleting exertion every time. That understanding of discipline is not just incomplete. It is the precise reason most people fail to sustain it. What the science of willpower, the psychology of self-regulation, and the behavioral patterns of the most consistently disciplined people in history actually reveal is something radically different from this picture of endless internal combat. They reveal that discipline at its deepest level is not a force applied against the self. It is a form of self-knowledge so complete and so honest that the battle largely disappears. That the most disciplined people are not the ones fighting the hardest. They are the ones who have understood something about the structure of human motivation and the architecture of their own psychology that makes the fight almost unnecessary. This is what we are going to examine. Not the surface-level tactics of habit formation that fill the self-help shelves, but the deeper psychology underneath them. The hidden architecture of willpower, the reason discipline fails, and the specific understanding that transforms it from an exhausting performance into something that runs almost automatically, like a current beneath the surface of a life that appears, from the outside, simply to be directed. The willpower lie. For most of the 20th century, the dominant model of self-control was simple and wrong. It held that willpower was a matter of character, that disciplined people were simply made differently, that they possessed a moral quality, a strength of will that less disciplined people lacked. And the implication of this model, never fully stated but always present, was that failure of self-control was a failure of character, a personal deficiency, a weakness that the sufficiently motivated individual should be able to overcome through the simple application of more effort. This model was wrong in every direction simultaneously. It was wrong about what willpower is, wrong about how it works, wrong about why it fails, and wrong, most damagingly, about what to do when it does. The research that began dismantling this model came from an unexpected direction. In the 1990s, psychologist Roy Baumeister and his colleagues conducted a series of experiments that would generate decades of debate and ultimately transform how scientists and psychologists understood self-control. The studies suggested that willpower functioned less like a character trait and more like a muscle, that it was a resource, finite, depletable, subject to fatigue in ways that were measurable and predictable. The initial experiments were elegant in their simplicity. Participants who had been required to resist eating freshly baked cookies in favor of radishes gave up significantly faster on a subsequent frustrating puzzle than participants who had not been required to exercise self-control first. Something about the act of resisting the cookies had depleted a resource that the puzzle then required. The resource was the same resource, and it had been spent. This phenomenon was called ego depletion, and for nearly 2 decades it shaped how researchers, clinicians, and eventually the general public thought about self-control. The implications seemed clear. Willpower was limited. Using it in one domain reduced its availability in others. And the solution, if you wanted to maintain self-control across a full day, was to be strategic about where and when you spent it. The research has since been complicated. Replications have produced inconsistent results. The simple hydraulic model of willpower as a single depletable resource has been challenged and refined. But the core insight that emerged from the debate, the insight that survived the methodological arguments and the failed replications, is more interesting than the original model and more useful. The insight is this: willpower is not primarily a resource that gets used up. It is a relationship between motivation, belief, and the cognitive demands of a given moment. And understanding that relationship is where the real science of discipline begins. The architecture of failure. Before we can understand how discipline works, we need to understand with unusual precision how it fails. Because the failure of discipline is not random. It follows patterns. It has a structure. And that structure, once visible, reveals exactly where the intervention needs to happen. The first pattern of failure is what researchers call decision fatigue. The human mind, when required to make a large number of decisions across a period of time, gradually shifts toward two failure modes. It begins making increasingly conservative, risk-averse choices, or it begins making increasingly impulsive ones. Either way, the quality of the decision-making degrades. Not because the person becomes less intelligent, but because the cognitive resources required for careful deliberative choice are finite and have been partially exhausted. The implication for discipline is direct. Every act of self-control that requires conscious deliberation draws on the same pool of cognitive resources that conscious decision-making requires. The person who is making hundreds of small decisions across a day is depleting the same resource that resisting temptation requires in the evening. And the person who structures their life to eliminate unnecessary decisions preserves that resource for the moments when genuine self-control is required. This is why the most consistently disciplined individuals across virtually every domain share a specific behavioral pattern that looks, from the outside, like eccentricity. They eliminate optionality from the trivial areas of their life with a thoroughness that strikes most observers as excessive. They eat the same foods. They wear the same kinds of clothes. They follow the same morning routine with a rigidity that appears almost compulsive. They are not doing this because they lack imagination or flexibility. They are doing it because they understand, consciously or intuitively, that decision-making capacity is not infinite, and they have decided, deliberately, which decisions are worth spending it on. The second pattern of failure is more psychologically complex. It is the failure that comes from treating discipline as an identity-external imposition rather than an identity-consistent expression. And it is, in the long run, far more destructive than decision fatigue. When a person experiences their disciplined behavior as something they are forcing themselves to do against their own desires, something fundamentally in conflict with who they are and what they want, the maintenance of that behavior requires continuous costly effort. Every day is a new battle. Every temptation is a genuine threat. The system is inherently unstable because it is built on the continuous suppression of something that the person experiences as their authentic impulse. But when a person experiences their disciplined behavior as an expression of who they are, as something consistent with their deepest sense of identity rather than in conflict with it, the maintenance of that behavior requires dramatically less effort. The question is no longer, do I feel like doing this today? It becomes, this is what someone like me does. And that shift, from external compulsion to internal identity, is the single most powerful transformation available in the entire domain of self-regulation. The identity pivot. The most durable discipline in human psychology is not the discipline of effort. It is the discipline of identity. This distinction sounds simple. It is not. Because identity is not something you simply decide to change. It is not a label you apply to yourself and then inhabit automatically. It is built through evidence, through the accumulation of specific behaviors that confirm a specific self-conception over time, and it is rebuilt the same way, one small confirmation at a time until the new identity has enough evidence behind it to feel genuinely real, rather than aspirationally performed. The person who wants to become disciplined does not begin by attempting massive behavioral change and hoping that the identity will follow. They begin at the identity level. They ask not what do I want to do, but who do I want to be? And then they look for the smallest possible behavioral expressions of that identity that they can perform with consistency right now, in the current conditions of their actual life, rather than the idealized conditions of their imagined future life. This approach runs directly against the instinct of most people who decide to become more disciplined. The instinct is to go large, to redesign the entire day, to eliminate every bad habit simultaneously, to commit to a level of behavioral change so comprehensive and so demanding that the gap between current behavior and committed behavior is enormous. And the psychological research on this instinct is unambiguous. It almost always fails. Not because the goals are wrong, but because the gap is too large to cross in a single motivated leap, and the inevitable early failures do not just interrupt the behavior. They undermine the identity narrative that the behavior was supposed to be building. The alternative is not less ambition. It is smaller steps toward the same destination. The 2-minute rule, the concept of minimum viable habits, the deliberate undershooting of early targets. All of these approaches work by the same mechanism. They make success sufficiently likely that the identity-confirming evidence begins to accumulate. The person who commits to 2 minutes of the practice and does it consistently for 30 days has 30 pieces of evidence that they are the kind of person who does this practice. And that evidence, modest as it sounds, is the raw material from which genuine disciplined identity is constructed, the enemy within the system. There is a dimension of the discipline problem that most frameworks for self-improvement carefully avoid discussing, because it is uncomfortable, because it implicates not just behavioral patterns but the deeper psychological structures that those patterns are serving. The uncomfortable truth is that many of the behaviors that discipline is supposed to overcome are not simply failures of willpower. They are functional. They are serving a purpose. They are providing something that the person genuinely needs, even if the provision is destructive and the cost is high. The person who cannot stop scrolling through their phone late into the night is not simply failing to exercise self-control. They are meeting a genuine need for stimulation, novelty, and connection that their waking life is not adequately providing. The person who cannot maintain a consistent exercise habit is not simply lazy. They may be operating under a level of chronic stress and exhaustion that makes additional physical demand feel genuinely threatening to an already depleted system. The person who cannot control their eating is not simply lacking willpower. They may be managing an emotional state for which food has become the most reliable and immediately available regulation strategy. None of this means that the behaviors are acceptable or that change is impossible. It means that discipline applied without this understanding is discipline applied to the symptom while the underlying function remains unaddressed. And discipline applied to a symptom while the function remains unaddressed tends to produce one of two outcomes. Either it succeeds in suppressing the symptom, and the underlying need finds another, sometimes worse, outlet. Or it fails repeatedly, each failure producing guilt and shame that makes the underlying need more acute and the problematic behavior more compelling. The more useful approach begins with genuine curiosity about the function, about what the behavior is actually doing, about what need it is meeting, and whether that need can be met in a way that does not carry the same costs. This is not the language of excuse. It is the language of genuine understanding. And genuine understanding of what a behavior is doing is always the most direct route to changing it sustainably. The neuroscience of habit. Beneath the psychology of discipline lies a biology that is important to understand. Not because biology is destiny, but because understanding the mechanism reveals why certain approaches to behavioral change work and others do not. Habits, in the neurological sense, are patterns of behavior that have been encoded in the basal ganglia, a set of structures deep in the brain that are associated with procedural learning, motor control, and automatic behavior. When a behavior is performed repeatedly in a consistent context, the neural pathway associated with that behavior is progressively strengthened through a process of myelination, the wrapping of the neural axon in a fatty sheath that dramatically increases the speed and efficiency of signal transmission along that pathway. The result of this process is a behavior that requires progressively less conscious effort and conscious intention to execute. It becomes, in the colloquial sense, automatic. And once it is automatic, it is extraordinarily durable, because it is no longer dependent on the variable resources of conscious willpower. It runs on a different system entirely. This is both the promise and the peril of habit formation. The promise is that behaviors which begin as effortful can become effortless if they are performed consistently enough in consistent enough conditions. The peril is that this same mechanism applies to the behaviors you are trying to eliminate. The bad habit is not simply a behavior you keep choosing. It is a deeply encoded neural pattern that activates automatically in the presence of its associated cues, producing urges that feel compulsive precisely because they are being generated by a system that is older and faster than conscious deliberation. The implication for discipline strategy is significant. Relying on willpower to override a deeply encoded habit, to sit in the presence of the cue and consciously choose not to execute the associated routine, works sometimes and under some conditions. But it is always a battle fought on the habit's home ground, using resources that the habit does not need. The more effective approach is environmental. It is the removal or alteration of the cues that trigger the automatic behavior before the automatic behavior has been initiated. Because a habit that is never triggered is a habit that never needs to be overridden. This is the logic behind the seemingly mundane advice to not keep certain foods in the house, to leave the phone in a different room, to lay out workout clothes the night before. These are not trivial behavioral tricks. They are precise interventions at the level of the cue, the first link in the neural chain that produces automatic behavior. And intervening at the cue level requires no willpower at all, because the battle is over before it has begun. The discipline of environment. The most important insight in the entire science of self-regulation is one that most people spend their entire lives failing to act on. You do not rise to the level of your goals. You fall to the level of your systems. And your systems are largely determined by your environment. This is not a metaphor. It is a description of how behavior actually works at the level of the nervous system. Human beings are environmental creatures. The behaviors we produce are not primarily the output of our internal states and intentions. They are primarily the output of the interaction between our internal states and the environmental context in which those states occur. Change the environment, and you change the behavior, often with startlingly little conscious effort required. The person who wants to read more but spends their evenings in a room where the television is the dominant piece of furniture is fighting their environment every evening. The person who rearranges the room so that the book is the most visible and accessible object in their usual sitting position has removed the fight entirely. The behavior is now being supported rather than resisted by the environmental architecture. This principle scales to every domain of discipline. The workspace that is designed to minimize distraction and maximize the accessibility of the tools required for deep work produces more deep work than the workspace that is designed for comfort and variety. The kitchen that is stocked with foods that support the eating pattern you want to maintain and cleared of foods that undermine it produces better eating behavior than the kitchen that requires willpower at every meal. The social environment that consists primarily of people who model and reinforce the behaviors you are trying to cultivate produces more consistent behavior than the social environment that pulls in the opposite direction. The design of your environment is perhaps the single highest leverage intervention available in the pursuit of greater discipline, because it shifts the default. It makes the desired behavior the path of least resistance rather than the path of most resistance. And human beings, like water, tend to flow along the path of least resistance. The disciplined person does not fight this tendency. They engineer it. When discipline breaks, even the most carefully constructed systems of self-regulation break. Even the most deeply established habits are disrupted. Even the most thoroughly designed environments encounter conditions they were not designed for. And the way a person responds to the breaking of their discipline is often more consequential for the long-term trajectory of their behavior than the breaking itself. The most destructive response to a lapse in discipline is what psychologists call the abstinence violation effect. The cognitive and emotional response to a single failure that frames that failure as evidence of fundamental incapacity, and that uses the logic of already broken to justify the complete abandonment of the behavioral standard. The person who misses one day of exercise and then misses the next 30, because they already broke the streak. The person who eats one food that was outside their intended pattern, and then eats nothing but that food for the rest of the week because the diet is already ruined. The person who spends one day in unproductive distraction and then spends the next month in the same state, because what is the point? This response pattern is not irrational within its own logic. If discipline is understood as an all or nothing state, as something you either have or you do not, then a single failure genuinely is evidence of its absence. But that understanding of discipline is itself the problem. Discipline is not an all-or-nothing state. It is a practice. And practices are not invalidated by imperfect execution. They are defined by the consistency of the return after the inevitable departure. The most useful reframe available in the moment of a lapse is one of the simplest and most counterintuitive in the entire psychology of self-regulation. The lapse is not evidence that the system has failed. It is evidence that the system is being used. The person who never lapses is the person who never attempts anything demanding enough to require a recovery. And the person who lapses and returns, calmly and without excessive self-recrimination, is doing something that the person who never lapses will never have the opportunity to do. They are building the specific capacity for recovery that is, in the long run, more important to sustain discipline than any other single psychological skill. Never miss twice, not as a rigid rule, as a principle of return. The single departure is human. The pattern of departure is the thing worth examining. And between those two things lies the entire practice of discipline. The deepest form, everything we have examined so far, the structure of willpower, the architecture of habit, the psychology of identity, the design of environment, the practice of recovery, all of it points towards something that the tactical discussion of discipline rarely reaches. The deepest form of discipline is not behavioral. It is not the absence of bad habits or the presence of good ones. It is not the morning routine or the workout or the diet or the work schedule, though all of these may be its expressions. The deepest form of discipline is attentional. It is the capacity to direct your awareness repeatedly and with genuine intention toward what actually matters to you. To resist the continuous pull of distraction, of comfort, of the immediate and the urgent, toward the deeper and the more important and the more difficult. To keep returning again and again to the thing that your clearest and most honest self knows is the work of your particular life. This attentional discipline is harder than any behavioral discipline because it has no clear completion. There is no moment at which you have finished directing your attention toward what matters and can rest. The pull of distraction is continuous. The seduction of the easier thing is always present. The rationalizations for today being the exception are always available. And the practice of returning, of noticing the departure and choosing again, is the work of every day until the last one. But this is also what gives discipline its deepest meaning. Not as a strategy for achieving goals, though it is that. Not as a mechanism for behavioral optimization, though it is that too. But as a form of ongoing relationship with yourself, with the version of you that knows what matters. With the life that becomes possible when what you do and what you value are the same thing, the person who has mastered that relationship has not achieved a static state of perfect self-control. They have developed a dynamic practice of continuous return, of noticing the drift and choosing again, of treating every moment of redirection not as a failure, but as the practice itself. That is the art of discipline, not the white-knuckled suppression of everything you desire. Not the performance of perfect behavioral consistency for an audience of people whose admiration you are hoping to earn, but the quiet, private, daily practice of returning to yourself, to your values, to the work, to the life that your clearest self already knows how to live. The only question that has ever mattered in the entire domain of self-regulation is not whether you will drift. You will drift. Every person who has ever attempted to live deliberately has drifted. The question is how quickly you return. And the answer to that question, practiced consistently enough across enough time, is the answer to who you become.